Thanks very much, Jim. I am Joe Grady, and I'll repeat Jim's welcome. Thanks for coming out on another beautiful winter evening here in Newport. We've had, actually it's warmer than average tonight, right? It's actually above freezing for the next few hours anyway. I wonder if, how many of you recognize the individual on the front of your program for tonight? There's a photo on there. Who's that speaking? Inhofe. Remember you saw this story this week? Where there's a Senator Inhofe proving that there's no such thing as climate change. For those of you who missed it, there is no such thing as climate change, and we know that because it's been a very snowy winter. So our topic for tonight is Science Under Attack, Politics, Policy, and Science in America. And we're going to be discussing the role of science in the United States, in our nation, in the collective decisions that we make as we make our policies, whether they're about transportation or food or energy or whatever the range of decisions are that we make as a society and as a state here in Rhode Island. I'm going to moderate our discussion. We would like it to be very interactive. We're looking forward to the kinds of great questions and lively discussion that we are now used to at these events. We're, again, very grateful you could all be here for it. And we're very lucky to have with us again tonight some terrific panelists. We're going to be hearing first from Suzanne Shaw. I've known Suzanne for about 10 years. She is the brilliant communications director for the Union of Concerned Scientists up in Cambridge. And Suzanne directs all of the communications for that organization on a very wide range of issues, from nuclear security to sustainable food to climate change and many other topics. She's been there since 2000. So she's been there for 15 years and has a wealth of experience to draw on. I'm sure a lot of that will come into play in our discussion tonight. She also leads the UCS Center for Science and Democracy, which is very closely connected to what we'll be talking about tonight. What is the role of science for a democratic nation in its decision making? And after hearing from Suzanne Shaw, we will hear from Todd Bianco. And Todd is currently the Principal Policy Associate for the Rhode Island Public Utilities Commission. So Todd is involved in helping to regulate and make sure that we have adequate and clean water in our state, and as well as the natural gas, electricity, wastewater utilities, and so forth. So Todd has a very important job in where science plays an important role in our state in helping making sure that our resources are handled properly, our utilities are handled properly, and so forth. But prior to this position, Todd was down in D.C. in the office of our own Senator Sheldon Whitehouse. And by the way, speaking of Senator Whitehouse, if you haven't seen his response to the senator with the snowball, it's worth taking a look at. I think he delivers a powerful and entertaining rebuttal. In Senator Whitehouse's office, Todd was very involved in science policy and policy related to climate, and has a lot to say about scientific topics as they relate to policy at the national level as well as at the state level here in Rhode Island. I want to make sure to emphasize that Todd is here not in his official capacity tonight. He is not speaking for the Public Utilities Commission or the state of Rhode Island. He is here in his capacity as a concerned individual, but brings quite a bit of government experience to the table in our conversation. So I've asked each of our panelists to come up and just speak for a few minutes, tell you a bit about their experience, lay some topics out on the table, and then we're going to turn it into more of a conversation. I'll ask them some questions, and of course we will be looking forward to lots of questions from all of you. So without further ado, I will turn it over first to Suzanne Shaw. Please help me welcome her.
There are a lot of people out there in the world who hold really pseudoscientific beliefs. So 28% of Americans believe that astrology has some influence on their lives. 35% believe houses can be haunted. And fully 50% believe in some form of ESP. So this is concerning, but it's not new. This has been the case for a long time. And there is good news out there in the landscape. When we ask people who they trust, scientists are often at the very top of that list or close to the top. Military leaders often come in just above scientists. But people really do trust scientists. And so even if you hold anti-science beliefs, you're likely to go along with what the scientists are telling you because they're credible. And so it seems like that would lead to good evidence-based decision-making. But that's true to a point. Unless you're emotionally invested in a point of view that runs counter to the science. And then it becomes very easy for you to toss out the science. And, lest you think this is a partisan issue, Democrats and Republicans can both throw out the science, liberals and conservatives. And it doesn't even matter your education level. So let's look at a couple of issues. So on the conservative side, gun control. If you fervently believe in the Second Amendment, you're unlikely to really listen to evidence that gun regulation can reduce gun violence. If you believe deeply in the free market and oppose government regulation on business, it's going to be very hard for you to accept that science that climate change is underway and human-caused. On the liberal side, in Portland, Oregon, well-educated community, quite liberal, they just voted down putting fluoride in the water despite 65 years of very strong scientific evidence that it is safe and effective for oral health. And what's been in the news a lot lately, vaccines. Also something that really more liberal side of the spectrum really question. This is based on the best that anyone can tell on one study many years ago that drew a link between vaccines and autism. That study was garbage. It was falsified. The data was cooked, and it was refuted more than a decade ago. But this lives on. So ideology trumping science happens. It happens for emotional reasons, ideological reasons. But something that we're seeing today is different. And that's, or it's increasing. When special interests, well-funded special interests, start pushing an anti-science agenda with a lot of money behind it. So here's a familiar case. It's not a new case, but it's one we're all familiar with, right? Tobacco. When the tobacco industry started a couple hundred years ago, nobody knew smoking was bad for you. But by the time the Surgeon General released the report in 1964, thousands and thousands of research studies had been done showing a link between smoking and cancer. So the tobacco industry clearly knew. They were following that science. And what they chose to do, instead of trying to address the problem, change their business model, what have you, is that they launched a campaign of deception so that they could go on selling their product. And here we have an internal memo that was discovered that, doubt is our product. It's very cynical. It says in here, doubt is our product since it is the best means of competing with the quote-unquote body of fact that exists in the minds of the general public. It is also the means of establishing a controversy. These tobacco executives knew that as long as there was a controversy, a debate about the science, they could forestall regulation of their product. So that's sort of the example we're all very familiar with. I work a lot on climate change, as Joe mentioned. We see exactly the same thing happening today. It's very much the same playbook. There is no question among scientists who study climate change that our Earth is warming because we are putting too much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, that the primary source of that carbon dioxide is the burning of fossil fuels, and that it's going to have very, very severe consequences for Americans and people around the planet as well as species. But there is an organized and well-funded effort led by the fossil fuel industry, led by other groups like Koch, the Koch brothers, I'm sure you've all heard of, who are in the refining business and have very deep pockets, as well as groups with free market ideas who really are against regulation. They've got front groups like the Heartland Institute and conservative pundits to amplify this message. And this has really been working because special interests are playing into people's personal identities. If I'm a conservative and I tend to agree with Rush Limbaugh on many issues, or I tend to agree with what I hear on Fox News, I'm going to go along with what they're saying on climate change. And they're saying the science is unsettled. They're saying there's lots of scientists on the other side of the debate when that's simply not true. And for many people, raising their hand and saying, I actually believe in climate change, I've looked at this, would put them in Al Gore's camp. And that's very counter to their personal identity. So it's a very hard thing for them to do. So this is a huge challenge, and I don't have all the answers, but I can tell you a few things that I've learned over the years that I think really helps in these situations. And this applies to all of us, whether we're scientists or not, that we connect the evidence that we know to things that touch people's lives. This is a picture of the devastation from Hurricane Sandy. And while, a scientist will never say, oh, global warming caused Sandy, that particular storm, what the scientists who study climate change will tell you is the oceans are warmer, and that is amplifying storms, and sea levels are rising, and that accounted for a greater degree of damage when those tides came in. We have to make science accessible. It's sometimes scientists and all of us, when we talk about these issues, talk up here. We need to talk without jargon. We need to simplify our messages. We need to use visuals so people can really understand what we're talking about. We need to listen to social science researchers like Joe, who do research to figure out how you can approach these issues in ways people can hear. There's a lot of ways that people like me or scientists talk about issues that really shut people down. And there's an increasing body of social science research that tells us how to approach problems in an authentic, honest way that opens up people's listening. And that's a really exciting area of research. And then the final thing I'll say is science can help us define problems, but science also helps lead us to solutions. And when we're talking about challenging issues, we need to talk about what are the solutions. We need to give people hope, because if you just tell people how bad things are and how bad they're going to get, that's a scary proposition, and people shut down. And that really happens across all the kinds of issues that we're facing. So I'll just leave you by saying, we have to keep at this because science matters. It's fundamental for the functioning of our democracy, and we'll all suffer as a nation if we ignore it.
So I agree with a lot of what Suzanne was saying, and I think what I want to start with, though, is sort of a little bit of difference of what happens here in the state and what's happening at the national level. So at the state, I can tell you my experience is that the government that I work with wants to make evidence-based and when possible, science-based decisions. But things really need to actually happen here at the state level, right? And things move quickly, and including evidence-based decision-making, science-based decision-making, takes a lot of time and a lot of planning. And so when there's a lack of it, I think that's usually the biggest hurdle. On the other hand, almost nothing is happening at the federal level, right? The Congress that I served in, I think, had passed maybe 1/3 as many laws as the Do Nothing Congress. And they had no intent, I think they thought they were doing a really good job. So the hurdle there is more of what Suzanne was talking about, which is to the politics that surround these issues. So in any decision, the trouble with getting science in there is that at some point, even if it doesn't belong there, an opinion will matter. to most of us, even in situations where it really doesn't belong. And I think Suzanne was touching on that emotional connection we have to our opinions. So if I don't have any slides, but I did bring a little mind game. It's the Monty Hall problem, which I hope you've never heard of, because I'll seem more interesting if you've never heard of it. So Monty Hall, I think he was the original host of Let's Make a Deal, but he was at least the host quite a while ago. And he's got 3 doors. And behind one of the doors is a car that you want to win. Behind the other 2 doors is a goat. Okay? So, Joe, pick a door. Door 1, door 2, door 3.
Door number 2.
Door number 2. Okay. Door number 2. Now, what Monty does, because he's such a great guy, he's going to show you a goat behind one of the other 2 doors. One of the other 2 doors has to have a goat. Remember, there's 2 goats, 1 car. So he shows you door number 3. They raise it, there's a goat. Now he says, before I show you what's behind the door you chose, do you want to switch? How many people want to switch doors? Okay, how many people want to stick with their door? How many people did a statistical analysis of whether or not they should switch? Okay, the answer is you should switch, statistically. Now, even if you did a statistical analysis and came up with the wrong answer, at least you tried. But the simplest explanation is there were 2 goats and 1 car, so in the first round, you probably chose a goat. Then he shows you the other goat, so the last door probably is the car. 2 times out of 3 by switching, you'll win. And if you don't believe me, go home, write it down. You can do it by, brute force. I'm telling you, switching will win more often than not switching. How many, now that I've even told you that, and I promise you, statistically, I am correct, and people have debated this at bars for decades, how many people, even now knowing that, still would have trouble switching doors? I can tell you, my father's here tonight. My mother and my mother-in-law will not switch doors because it would burn them up to know that they had chosen right, even though it's more successful to switch. I think that connection to our opinions is a big limit on getting evidence-based decision-making and science-based decision-making. Another problem related to that is we really don't practice it very often. So much of our decision-making, our life is really decision-making and an array of opinions. And so much of the time, we're making inconsequential decisions that don't really require us to review facts. Like a phone, for example. You probably chose a phone based on your budget, and hopefully it fits in your pocket, and maybe you needed a keyboard, or maybe you didn't. And then after that, it was a lot of, well, I kind of just like this phone. I am willing to bet there's nobody here who did a very accurate economic analysis that wound up with putting the perfect phone for them in their pocket. At some point, it's not worth your time, and your gut tells you, I just like this phone. The problem is when that's butted up against really good information in a consequential decision. And it's really hard to, when you know something and you have an opinion, you have very little uncertainty about that opinion, and you can feel it inside you. But then at the same time, you have this science evidence, and you can't always feel that inside you. Like, I tell you that I've done a lot of math in my life, and I can now, through training, I can feel the Monty Hall solution in me. But not everybody can. It takes practice to say that really is the right thing to do. I think that happens in a lot of decision-making processes for individuals, and that just percolates up to those who are actually in the position to make them. I want to talk about climate science. I think we're going to talk about it a lot tonight, but it's fair to just kick it off now. So much of it is certain, and I think the issue comes to when it's time to actually figure out what decision you want to do. That's where the little bit of uncertainty is, and that's where folks need to weigh their opinions that they have no uncertainty about in the science that seems very vague to them. So, for example, there is no debate over the laws of thermodynamics. No, there's no scientist who is debating that. The conservation of mass, energy, and momentum, this is definitely settled science. And as Suzanne said, there's no debate over whether or not carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas. It is. It's lab science, like 150-year-old lab science. There's no debate that humans are the ones putting most of the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere that's caused this accelerated emissions. There's no debate. Well, okay, maybe there's a little bit of debate, but it's not controversial. Even, I'm telling you, even very skeptical scientists, ones who put out contrarian research, and I don't mean to denigrate their research, folks like Roy Spencer or John Christie who are on the other side of the debate, even they agree that a doubling of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere should cause about 1 degree of warming. It's not controversial. That's like 100% of scientists agree. And also I'll say that 1 degree of warming isn't really very scary. I mean, I'm not trying to belittle it, but it's not necessarily the warming that we need to worry about. It's an extra 2 or 3 degrees. And here's where there's that uncertainty. How much warming is going to happen? Nobody is making legislation based on the first and second laws of thermodynamics, right? People want to make a law to avoid damage. They want to make a law based on, so they need to make a law based on how much damage is going to be caused, and that's related to that variability. There is some debate as to how much that warming will be. Maybe that 1 degree of warming will certainly, there's no controversy here, will cause more water to make it into the atmosphere. And that water is the greenhouse gas. That's not controversial. And that can trap heat, which will allow more water to get into the atmosphere, which will trap more heat, so on and so forth. It's a positive feedback. That's going to cause the extra 2 or 3 degrees or more of warming. That's really dangerous. Or there's some scientists out there, there's less evidence for it, but that think that there will be all that extra water in the atmosphere will cause a certain type of cloud that will reflect a lot of sun back into space, and there really won't be much warming. So even if you take that view and the warming of, say, 9 or 10 degrees, which is in some models, there's some point where it becomes dangerous. And then you need to take that and say, how much damage does it cause? Then you need to evaluate the value of that damage. What's the value of a coastline? What's the value of fisheries? These are things that you can make estimates on, but the error bars are even wider. They're even greater up for debate. Then you have to make additional, totally opinion-based judgments, like what to do about it. There are a number of things you could do about it. For example, you could say, I'm going to spend the amount of money that is no more than the benefits I can get. So every dollar I spend better earn $1 and a penny or more. Or you can say, what is the value of what's at risk? How much do I think I'm exposed to that risk? And I'm just going to hedge and hope that the worst of it doesn't hit me. Another thing you could do is say, what is the value of endowing to future generations a planet that is not harmed by pollution, and then just pay for it? All of those can be based on the same science, but they're all opinion. They're really your opinions on how you want to deal with the solution. Or you might want to do nothing at all because you really like the way things are now and you really want it not to change. And so in any of those, you might feel like your opinion bleeds back into all this error in estimation, which bleeds back into the uncertainty in science. You're certain about your opinions and you can't internalize that science. And I think it really, there are folks out there that Suzanne mentioned that know that about us. They know that we have trouble switching doors. And I think they use really good messaging to confuse us about the stuff that really isn't up for debate. And I hope we can talk about that tonight. And we can also talk about, if you want, some decision making at the state level and what the hurdles are there. And I really do think it's much different than the national topics. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. All right, well, I want to thank both of our speakers again. You can tell they bring a wealth of experience, knowledge, and perspectives to this topic. So I want to open it up to you very quickly. But first, just ask a couple quick questions of my own. I'm fascinated by something you mentioned in your part of the presentation, Suzanne, about the fact that Americans rate scientists so highly in terms of trustworthiness. I think they were the most trustworthy figure on that particular slide, far above most other public figures of various kinds. And yet we have all these ways in which Americans seem ready to disregard, ignore, and be suspicious of, be skeptical of science findings of various kinds, whether it's related to vaccinations or fluoride, and climate, of course, is one of the topics, but many others. So what do you think about when you think about that contradiction, that in general or in the abstract, they're the very most trusted people, and yet we're ready to throw out the particulars of what they have to say in so many cases?
Yeah, and I don't think that it's necessarily that people are throwing out, if they were just talking to one scientist, they would probably say, wow, that really makes sense. But the thing that we're seeing is this pitting scientists in this he said, she said, one-to-one battle. So talked about some of these scientists who are sort of on the contrarian side. They're small in number. There's about half a dozen active ones. And they'll say, oh, no, it's the sun. And as a layperson, you don't know who to believe. Should you believe the person that says, no, the science is quite certain, or the other person saying, no, I'm like Galileo, I'm ahead of my time, and I tell you it's the sun. Well, the climate science community will say, well, no, we've studied the sun to death. Yes, the sun influences our climate, but it does not account for the changes we've seen. It does not account for the carbon dioxide and the implications of that in the atmosphere. But people never get into that debate. We see this happening in the media, where the media pulls forward an expert on one side, an expert on the other. Sometimes that's honest, trying to show balance. Sometimes that is, I don't want to say dishonest, but in the case of something like Fox News, we looked at their science stories and found on the news side, the straight-up news side, they're really no worse than anybody else. But they have a lot of commentary, a lot of opinion folks, and they don't hold them to journalistic standards. And so they're out there just making stuff up, saying, oh, yes, the science isn't settled. Oh, yeah, repeated. So people think there's a debate when really there's not.
I think that I'm going to comment on that it is funny that when people are one-on-one, so I have a science background, and when
Why don't you give him the hand mic?
Okay, for 1 second. I think when folks are, it says mute. There we go. Sorry. Okay, can you hear me? How about now? I'll use it like a hand mic. So in a one-on-one conversation, right? Still? I will.
Thank you, sir.
Okay. In a one-on-one conversation, I do get the feeling that, I'm convincing someone of some scientific principle. But it does seem like as a group, they're not trusted. And so in that, chart of, who folks trust, the largest one is, like, if self could have been up there, right? It would have been the biggest thing, right? And I trust that I talk to someone and but if I'm getting it from, like, a conglomerate of scientists, I might not trust that. But I talked to a scientist, and she seemed very believable, I think is one of the interesting things. The other thing is that it's even after that, folks trust scientists. It is sort of odd how quickly someone might say to them, I think it's the sun that is causing this. And I just say to myself, well, don't you think, like, NASA scientists remembered to include the fireball in the sky when they were doing their modeling? That is a little surprising that it's so easy to lead people astray and convince them that there's it's just huge holes in science that really is very rigorous.
So it sounds, from what you're both saying, that part of the story is, well, we see covers on the National Geographic announcing that there's a war on science, but it sounds as though, from what you're saying, it may not be so much that the public is losing faith in science so much as that there are controversies being manufactured about which scientist is believable. So we hear about the climate denier scientists, and we hear about the thousands and thousands of scientists who do believe in climate change, and what the perception that is being created is that there is a scientific debate. So it's not that we are rejecting or being asked to reject science, it's that we're being asked to believe that the science isn't settled and that that's the more fundamental issue. Do you think something similar is going on with some of the other scientific controversies that have been mentioned, like with vaccines?
Can people hear me? Is my mic on? Okay. With vaccines, there isn't that I'm aware of, money being thrown at the anti-vaccine side of the debate. But what there is I'd call it the mommy echo chamber on the web that is sort of self-perpetuating. So I'm going to pick on a celebrity, Jenny McCarthy. And this poor woman has an autistic son. She's obviously very concerned about it, but she's latched onto this and used her celebrity to sort of help perpetuate this myth. She's not the only person doing it, but folks are desperate for an answer, and they think they're saving people by continuing to write about this, despite the fact that the American Academy of Pediatrics and the CDC and every scientific society that touches on medicine and vaccines have made it very clear that there is absolutely no evidence linking vaccines to autism, that vaccines are, it's not that vaccines never have side effects, but the good so far outweighs the downside. But it is this phenomenon that we see today that couldn't have happened 25 years ago, and that is this online echo chamber where almost anyone can start typing and have an audience if you're a good and provocative writer.
Yeah, I think that's... Am I on now? No. I think that's right, yeah. I think that's right that, there's no money trail back to someone that's benefiting from a lack of vaccination. So that is an important difference. But I think it does go back to that. It's really hard to weight the risks for folks, even though scientists have already weighted it for them. It seems like, I think, so one of my favorite psychologists, Daniel Kahneman, points out that, when you're facing a great loss, people tend to be gamblers. And so I think when folks look at, you're certainly, it's really, the scientific evidence is there. You're more likely to avert danger by having vaccination than by not. But there might be a side effect that you're emotionally attached to, that you feel strongly that you want to avoid, that is associated or that you believe to be associated with vaccination, and that's really anchoring people toward a bad decision. And I really don't know if there's a way to get around that, but I think that is what the cause is.
I'm just going to ask one more question before turning it over to our audience. But some of what we're talking about and some of what you've talked about, Todd, is sort of psychological reasons why people might tend to favor one view over another, even though the view they don't favor is the one that scientists tend to favor. But people may have, for emotional reasons or for what other psychological reasons, may prefer the other perspective. So that's an interesting area we might want to talk more about. But on the other hand, there is also a narrative that I know I've heard, probably many of us in the room have heard, or a set of narratives about scientists not being trustworthy, about scientists being motivated. Senator Inhofe refers to global warming as a hoax. He's implying that there are scientists who are deliberately and collectively deceiving us. And I know I've heard other references in the media to scientists who are motivated by getting their next grant or motivated by getting published in a certain journal rather than by seeking the truth. So there certainly are some narratives circulating in our culture that do cast doubt on science and the validity of science as a whole. I'm not sure how powerful these narratives are, but I know they're out there. what do you think about any of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think those narratives are out there. That particular narrative gained a lot of traction around 2010 when this cache of emails was stolen from a climate scientist. It was thousands of emails, and the person or group that stole them, still nobody knows who they were, published them and sort of implied all this like wrongdoing from little phrases and email exchanges that were quite innocent, like, you know, oh, I did this trick to make the data work. A term of art that a scientist talking to another scientist, but it sounds sneaky, right? And because this media machine ratcheted up and talked about the hoax and this is evidence of this worldwide conspiracy, it actually did get traction and actually did pretty rapidly change the number of people who were skeptical about climate science. Those numbers have since rebounded, but it was damaging. And, you know, I don't know. I imagine we have a number of scientists here in the room, and I'm sure many of you know scientists. I know a lot of scientists. I don't know a lot of really rich scientists raking in grant money and living high on the hog with mansions down in Newport. You know, so it's a pretty easy thing to bring back to reality, but there was a lot of shouting. I don't think it's an overall huge concern, but this kind of thing does surface from time to time. I would say something that's even worse that I've seen is groups going after individual scientists, trying to frighten them, trying to get them to back away from research, making outrageous demands on, you know, I'm going to your university, I'm asking for all of your email, I'm going to bog you down, keep you from your research by all these ridiculous requests. They're doing that to scientists at public universities because they are more accountable to taxpayers, and we've been involved in some of those cases.
That feels like a real war on science.
Yeah, I think that narrative is out there, and it's sort of, one thing I can say is that I'm just glad that my research has nothing to do with economics, and nobody really cared about it. When I think of, I cared about it, right? So I studied geophysics, and most of my research was like plate tectonic type research, which the plates move like as fast as your fingernails grow, and no money is changing hands over it. Hopefully, like if there's a shining light that comes out of anything, you know, a silver lining is that in the process of attacking some of these scientists, the result is we have like a body of research that is some of the most thoroughly vetted research in the history of science. I mean, not just looked at by scientists, but really sideways attacks from all sorts of groups that actually pretty good, stood the test of time, right? I mean, for groundbreaking research, and now I'm talking about some of the paleoclimate science that really didn't exist, and Michael Mann like bootstrapped that project up, has stood, and it's pretty impressive. And so I try and look for that silver lining there, that hopefully that's what's winning people back, is that time and time again more research just confirms it.
Let's hear from the audience. I'm sure you may have some questions for our panelists. Do we have a microphone that can? Okay, so Julie is going to bring the microphone to you. Please, if you don't mind, wait until you have the microphone before you ask your question, because that way we'll get you on our recording of this event. Thank you. So, over here.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, it's working.
Oh, it is? Okay. Thank you very much. I wonder if you might talk about science as a way rather than a thing in order to persuade us why we should listen to scientists. In other words, why might they be more trustworthy? I think that would sort of make the argument more effective.
Go ahead.
Okay. I think that gets to a little bit of what I was talking about in that it's very hard to use science in decision making, but we could in almost every decision we make. And I think that it would be nice if all of us tried to recognize when we were making bad decisions and then look forward to how else science is trying to be used and support that decision making. Let me give you an example. I think I'm rambling a bit, but like I speed, right? Does that, like maybe you speed? I always go at least 5 over on the highway. Okay, like that's policy, right? That's my policy. I'm always 5 over. I don't go 10, and I don't do the limit. This is Rhode Island, so I'm a Rhode Island guy. I'm not on the highway for more than like 10 miles. So if I'm 5 over on 95, I'm going to save about 50 seconds, which can't change. I can't change my life. There's so few times where 50 seconds matters in my life. There's so few times where 50 seconds will even change the rest of my hour. Okay. But if I'm in the car and I'm speeding, there's somebody who's doing the limit, and I'm pulling up on them. My wife might say to me, "Back off." What are you gonna say? 50 seconds? I'm gonna tell you, this is what I like to do. You know, this is when you're driving, you drive the speed you want to drive, and she speeds more than I do. So maybe her policy is to save more time. I think it starts somewhere in there. In everyday people recognizing that science is a way. I mean, you don't have to belabor every single decision, but clearly I'm making a mistake. I'm saving no time. I'm going faster. If I'm in a crash, right, there's more momentum. I risk a ticket, and clearly making my wife nervous. And yet I do it. It's my policy. I said it. I'm unwilling to review it because I just don't practice science decision making every day.
You're saying do as I say, not as I do, sounds like.
Well, I guess the thing I would add is that in terms of science as a process, I mean, I think many people in the world think science is a set of facts. And science isn't a set of facts. It's a way we discover meaning in the world around us. And, let's talk about evolution for a second. So, people who don't believe in evolution, they're wedded to the idea that the world was created 4,000 years ago. They'll say, well, it's just a theory. And, every scientist goes, because, a theory is a scientific construct that has been, well established. Lots and lots of science has failed to take apart the theory of evolution, the hypothesis of evolution, so that it's now a theory, a scientific theory. And what science, the practice of science, is all about putting up a hypothesis, testing it, putting it before your peers who get kudos for tearing it down. And that is the process. And it's not established science until it has been replicated and over again and picked apart from every angle. And that is what sets it apart from opinion.
I think that's a great point.
I have an analogy I'd like you to address. Most Americans are very comfortable with buy now, pay later. We buy the house, we pay for it over 30 years. We buy the car, we pay over 5 years. The climate scientists are asking us to pay now for a future benefit. And in all studies of human beings, that's a hard sell. We want an immediate, tangible thing to hold on to. And future generations can pay for it. So I don't think the argument is necessarily about science. It's about, you're asking me to change. I'll say I don't believe you. It's not real science yet. It's an emotional thing. I don't want to pay now for a future benefit.
I think that's an excellent, excellent point. And I think Joe should also probably weigh in on this. I mean, what I would say is, boy, we got to reframe that, the way you're talking about that problem, because you're right. People don't like to pay for future benefits. What is something we all do? We all buy insurance because if there is, if someone told you there was a 90% chance, a 95% chance that your house was going to catch fire, would you buy insurance? You're damn right you would. And, that's kind of what we're facing, and that's what we're doing. It's the insurance policy. And then you can also turn this around to talk about, absolutely there are near-term benefits for cleaning up the electricity grid. We get a lot of our energy from coal. If you change to renewable energy, that is a lot. It's really going to clean up the air, and it's going to make a big difference for public health. So there are different ways to come at this, and there are all kinds of bad frames and bad ways people understand and talk about problems. And that's why I love working with Joe, because he does research that exactly says, oh, don't talk about it that way. People will react terribly if you do. And so many of the issues I work on environmental and security issues, and so many of the ways that folks in the fields I work in generally talk about things are kind of exactly the wrong ways to talk about it. So there's a lot of change that we need to do to be more effective.
I think it's a great analogy. My gut feeling is that a person would like to avoid that, but people in general, for some reason, would rather respond to a disaster after the fact. And there is some worry that folks are waiting for the undeniable evidence of climate change. I don't know, like hand of God climate change to appear before they'll act. And I do think, though, that there's enough people in society that we don't have to wait to convince everybody. And it needs to be, convincing decision makers to use science and say, listen, score it. How much damage do you think can be done, and how much do you want to pay to avoid it?
I'm Ken Walsh. I'm an engineer, a scientist. Generally, science is appreciated because when a scientist makes predictions, he generally makes a prediction that's verifiable. For instance, when Einstein did his relativity theories, one of the things he predicted was the bending of light in the sun's gravitational field. They sent an expedition, I think in 1905, to Africa during an eclipse. They measured the bending of starlight in the sun's gravitational field. It was verified. Everybody says, gee, that's nice, and we believe it. In your slides, you showed cigarette burning. Carcinogens cause cancer, right? I look around. My brother-in-law died of lung cancer. He smoked from the time he was 14. My folks did not smoke. They lived a long, healthy life, didn't get that cancer. So that's an immediate thing that I can look at and verify that what I'm saying is true. There's another example. Just recently, some folks using data from a telescope on the South Pole thought they found evidence of gravitational waves in the early noise fields from intergalactic noise. Turned out that once they made that prediction, everybody else took a look at it. They used space-based telescopes and found out it was an atmospheric effect. Right? So again, verifiable. Right? And I would suggest that that's the reason why global warming is generally not thought much of by the little fellow on your scale, right? Because he looks outside and gets buried in snow this winter, and it's cold, right? And it doesn't make sense to him that this is a short-term phenomena that he's got to worry about. Maybe his great-great-grandchildren, but not him. Does that make some sense?
Yeah, it absolutely does. I mean, that's a really good point. I mean, it's we see variations in people are always more concerned about climate change in a hot, scalding summer when, if you live in the West, when there's massive wildfires, when you're dealing with a natural disaster that's linked to climate change. During cold winters, concern goes down. Maybe it's not so bad. So that does sort of play on people's sort of near-term horizons. I will say that there are lots of groups of people out there in the world. I mean, the climate has now been changing for a long time. If you're younger than 30, and we don't have that many younger than 30s in the room, but if you are, you've never lived in a year that had below average global temperatures. And so farmers, pretty conservative group of people, they know something's up. And it's a funny thing to see their reaction because, again, many farmers who are politically conservative do not want to say, I believe the climate is changing, I believe humans are causing it, because it puts them in Al Gore's camp, and he's not their guy. But they will tell you, yeah, something's up. We are not living in the same kind of place that I knew when I was young, that my dad experienced when he was farming. And I don't really know what's going on. Maybe it's these big cycles, but it's worrisome. And, I'm open to doing something about it. And so I think there's some hope there. We don't really actually have to get people, I know we're talking a lot about climate here, to raise their right hand and say, I believe, to actually want to take action. Because people are beginning to see worrisome changes in their environment beyond the weather. But
yeah, that's right. I don't think we'll ever have a, like 6 o'clock news. Like Mark Searles is not going to come on with the climate change of the day. It's mostly we care about the weather. There's not going to be like a climate change Giorgi factor probably or anything like that in the near future. But I do think what Suzanne's getting at is, there are ways to reach people, and I don't actually know if scientists can do it. They're probably the worst group of people in some ways to figure that out. But I think that what hopefully is convincing to people eventually will not really be that there's a consensus of scientists, but a consilience of information. Every line of evidence that is independent, maybe the thing you're experiencing, and a reduction of a cryosphere or droughts or rising the oceans and warming the atmosphere all point toward the same thing. And they're independent of each other, really. They're phenomena that are somewhat related, but all point toward warming. And hopefully that will be convincing, that sheer weight and balance of that evidence.
If it makes you feel any better, I didn't buy firewood today because it felt like summer was almost here. So I kind of wanted to get to what seems like the core of what you do. There was an article written by one of the professors at Newark that was put out this week that talked about sort of the giving up on expert opinion because things like social media have democratized people's opinions, and we've been placing people's opinions as sort of an important value in that if you criticize them, then you're attacking them and you're devaluing their freedom of speech. And it sounds to me also like some of the big media campaigns that you've talked about sowing doubt by attacking people's values. And I hear when you speak that your messages are well framed and deliberate, it sounds like. Are there people that are working on is there sort of like a think tank for communications about the environment? Is there a PR firm for the environment? Who is working on trying to address those core values in a bigger, better way than what we're seeing from the opposite side in public media?
there's not one group I would point to that plays that role. And yet I do think there is a level of sophistication, especially in the climate field. I mean, this is something that, not only is the science well documented, but, it's interesting. So I deal with a lot of scientists, and if, Todd's a scientist, he's up here talking in a very, calm way about this. When I'm talking to scientists who aren't standing on podiums, they're like beside themselves about this problem. Like, I can't believe that we've been debating this now for, going on 30 years, and my God, the earth is burning. They would never stand up and say that because, it makes me sound, Greenpeace-y, and I mean no disrespect to anybody who's a member of Greenpeace, a great organization, but there is a whole, there has been, in the 15 years that I've been doing this business, one of the very first, I think the first time I got to know Joe was a study that he was involved in 15 years ago that really looked at how can you talk about climate change in a way that gets people to listen. And there's been a lot in this field. There's a lot of things that are happening that are positive. And I mean, honestly, the biggest problem is we are up against, in this particular area, really, really powerful forces. The Exxon Mobils of the world are the biggest corporations, not in the United States, in the entire world. That power is dwarfing the power of government. It's pumping a lot of money into elections. And, I won't say that, every elected official that sits on the other side of this issue, is bought and paid for, but they're ideologically think they're doing the right thing. They think government regulation is bad. They think, oh, this problem can't really be as bad as they say. They're worried about getting reelected, and they know that in their districts, this is a hot button issue. And so, there are, it's not as simple. There isn't a simple answer like, if we just got the message right, everything would come together. I do see encouraging signs. We got very close to getting federal legislation on climate change a few years back, and then the bottom fell out of the economy, and it made it real hard. Some things changed politically in this country, not disconnected from that economic meltdown, and we lost a lot of important time on this issue because actually, the warming really is accelerating. So.
There are at least 2 university groups or centers that are focused on climate change communication. I mean, it's such a big challenge. It's such a complex problem. There are so many forces, so many reasons why it's hard for people to get it, that there's a lot of effort going into trying to figure out the communications piece of this, but nothing compared to what Exxon and Mobil can spend, of course. Before getting more questions from the audience, I just wanted to raise a broader question about American culture, because as Suzanne has alluded to a few times, my work has mainly focused on trying to understand how Americans think about these topics, why they respond the way they do to certain kinds of information or messages, and how to create messages that are more engaging, more enlightening, and so forth. So I've done a lot of work trying to figure out what Americans respond to, how they respond, and one of the patterns that I've certainly seen is that if you create a message that sounds like it's teaching science, it's a sure loser. People do not want to be taught science. I mean, with some exceptions, maybe some of you in this room enjoy, explicitly learning something new about science. But for the most part, if you create a message or go out with in an interview or on your web page or in an op-ed in the paper and sound like you're giving a science lecture, you're kind of dead when it comes to communications, unfortunately. It's kind of sad but true. So therefore, most of the communications approaches that that I and colleagues have tested and ended up recommending to Suzanne are more like what you could call stealth teaching. Like you can teach somebody something as long as they don't know you're teaching them something. So I just wonder if that relates in any way to your own experience with communication or things you've seen in the culture, or if what I'm saying resonates with you in any way, either of you.
Okay, so in my position now, I would have to say definitely not. Although I can respect that. My position now is advising directly to decision makers. I had better not get caught stealth teaching them. I try to be very blunt with the evidence, and it's that one-on-one trust that gets built in that I use. However, I think this is the first time I'm hearing it. It makes a lot of sense. So.
Yeah, I'm talking specifically about broad public communications and the kind of things that people just tune out. Not that they hate it and they hate science, just that it's not for them. It's not the kind of thing they naturally want to pay attention to.
Yeah, yes, and I would say regulators are different. Regulators like the details, and they want to know everything. We do a lot of work with regulators because they're hungry for technical information. But yeah, that completely resonates with me. I mean, most people didn't go into science because it was a boring subject they didn't particularly like studying in school. Sure, they like scientists, they like doctors, but they would much rather see what Kim and Kanye are doing on TV. And so, people don't have a big bandwidth, but and when Joe says stealth, I just want to be really clear. This isn't, we're not talking about doing something sneaky or underhanded. This is introducing a subject like climate change, saying, this is a challenge, but it's a human-caused problem, and it has human solutions. We know how to tackle it, and we have technology that can start reducing emissions today. We know the Earth is warming because we're putting too much CO2 in the atmosphere. See, I just taught you something about science and you didn't even know because you were excited I was telling you about solutions. So that's really what we're talking about, how you sequence in ideas, not doing something sneaky and underhanded or trying to be deceptive.
No, not at all. And part of what I was pointing to was what I think is a real challenge just in our culture. Because maybe it's possible that people trust scientists, as your illustration showed, but don't relate to them at all. And this relates to one of the earlier questions about science as a way. So what if it were the case that Americans generally think of scientists as trustworthy, for the most part, but don't think of them as regular people that they can relate to? I don't know how a scientist thinks. That they talk a language I don't understand, and it's not one that I even ever wanted to understand. So I think there's an interesting cultural challenge here about Americans' attitudes towards just how science works and whether it's something they're even equipped to think about, and whether that creates problems for us in these conversations. Yes, please, sir.
Yes, I think part of the problem is we live too short a life. We haven't seen enough. We're not aware of enough. And people should take the time to study various topics like climate change. The Earth has been changing its climate for the last 2.5 billion years, as long as it's had time to create an atmosphere, even though the Earth is 4.5 billion years old. And since then, it's been changing its climate according to many other factors, astronomical, geophysical, etc. Prior to 1950, just shortly before that, there was a scientist or a meteorologist in Germany who said, I think the continents are moving. And the scientists said, oh no, that can't happen, that doesn't happen. Well, now we know that what they called continental drift then is in fact a reality. And with the continents in their present position and other factors, It lends more toward a situation where we have alternating glaciation and melting with changes in temperature, etc. Over the last 600,000 years, we've gone through 5 cycles. Now, we may be approaching the end of the current interglacial period. But we don't know that. We don't live long enough. It might take another 1,000 years. So these are the factors that people have to be aware of. But people don't want to see change. They think it's always been the way it is now.
Well, if you're going to be talking about plate tectonics, you're talking my language. But I think that is,
Sorry.
I think you're right, and that really existed for, actually, people really believed for until, maybe the 1950s, that the Earth was pretty much as created, and however, there were all these lines of evidence that the continents were once connected, right? I mean, you had mountain ranges that crossed the ocean somehow, and fossils that shouldn't be where they were, and on different continents, right, of palms and things like that in really cold southern places. And that's just had the shape, right? The shape is just, I mean, even as a kid, I can remember looking at the map and just saying, like, these things go together, right? Like, everybody gets that. And I didn't know until years later they do, right? And every single time, this is why, like, plate tectonics is so amazing to me, is every time there was new evidence, like, boy, they really seem like they used to be together, there was this lack of why. But the scientists kept pushing, right, and pushing. It was continental drift. And then they said, but how would they move? Somebody said, maybe it's the spin of the Earth. And, the physicists went to their labs and said, absolutely not. That's not even close. That can't possibly be true. And they were right. It couldn't. It was something else. But that's the point. We have plate tectonics now, and it's a really great theory. And it explains almost every observable on the surface of the Earth, except like Hawaii or Iceland or Galapagos, which shouldn't be there, right? So we can do one of two things, right? We can throw out the theory of plate tectonics, even though it makes great sense and does all this wonderful prediction, and we have really great evidence for it. And it was the result of vetting over really 150 years. Or we can reconcile the existence of Hawaii and Iceland and Galapagos with that theory. And I think that is something that happens, that I think it would be good for people to know about, for example, climate science. There are some things happening in the climate. You hear about the pause, for example. Yeah, there are some observations that cannot be perfectly predicted. I bet eventually they will be brought into the fold of a really good theory that makes a lot of excellent predictions. So I never tell people I believe in climate science. I'm convinced of that climate change is happening because it's the best, by far and away, the best explanation time and time again for a given set of observations. And so you're right, we don't live long enough, but the science gets past. That's a 200-year project that resulted in plate tectonics.
I think that the question about the way the public relates to science needs to also come back and look at it from the other point of view. In the last 50 years, as science has gotten more and more technical, more and more specialized, scientists have developed, well, there's been a culture, I think, in science. And the culture in science, in my own experience as a scientist, has been that within the culture of science, more and more people have become specialized and individualized, and they talk to their peers who judge their work. There's nothing there that's training them to talk to other than their peers. And beyond that, there's even often within science a disdain for those who popularize science. The science popularizer isn't really a scientist. And climate change is forcing scientists out of their comfort zone but it's a massive shift in the culture of some of the top specialists in science to reach the point where they feel that it's their responsibility to explain their work to others who are not technically in the same context that they are. And I think that culture shift in science is perhaps not realized how great a shift it is. And I'm not sure that we really even have the mechanisms or the institutions to try to help to develop that shift in the culture of the scientists themselves.
Yeah, I would just, I think that's a really good observation. And a couple things. I think, you know, as the world has gotten more complex, people are kind of in their knowledge silos. And it's hard, you know, there was a point in time, and it really wasn't very long ago, you know, 300 years ago, where, you know, one person could actually know what there was to know in the world. That is, you know, people can't even know everything there is to know in pretty narrow fields these days because there's so much. I will say there's a couple of encouraging things. First of all, I just, you know, the Union of Concerned Scientists is a place where we give an outlet to scientists who want to move beyond sort of their academic research and connect their expertise to, you know, apply their expertise to solve problems, to advise government, to advise decision makers in their community. So, you know, we have a network of about 18,000 scientists who engage with us in that kind of work. And then I will say one thing that I think is really exciting, and I know a lot of scientists in academia are really excited about, is the next generation of scientists coming up in the world. They really get the connection and the value of cross-disciplinary work. It is not yet rewarded in academia. I mean, there are a few campuses who are starting to promote that, but there's problems then, you know, speaking in university, I assume some of you work here or at other universities, you know, that it's not rewarded in tenure track, which is a problem, but that's, I think, changing. And there's a lot of exciting cross-disciplinary work happening. And I think we are going to see that kind of change and that kind of excitement from the scientific community about cross-discipline collaboration. And I think that's going to make us more capable problem solvers.
Yeah, thank you for being here. My name is Jim Chase. I'm in the biology department here at Salve, so your response feeds in very well to me speaking now. Interdisciplinary research is rewarded at this particular university, and there are interdisciplinary programs here. And so the tenure track does reward that here. My question is about scientific literacy. I wish you could address that a little bit. We know that for any number of metrics for the last number of years, scientific literacy, math, science, engineering in this country has been going down. Compared to most other industrialized nations, we're well behind. How, if we speak beyond American public policy about other countries and how they receive science and issues of scientific literacy in this country?
Yeah, that's true. I mean, I'm trying to pull the statistic out of my head, and it's bleak, but where we rank in math and science is not impressive. You know, I think that I don't know. I don't know if the reason to account for the lack of scientific literacy. You can blame it on the schools. You can blame it on the opportunities for distraction. You can blame it on a lot of things. You can blame it on our culture, which has a strong anti-intellectual bent, you know, that I think is sort of embedded in our, you know, can-do, self-made, you know, up from the bootstraps kind of culture that we have here that is really, you know, quite unique to the United States, a less collectivism. But I mean, I think it's a reason for concern, and you know, I worry about, you know, whether people are going into the sciences, and we're getting, if the best and the brightest are going into the sciences, or they're going to Wall Street. But I don't think that that's necessarily an excuse for not having science-based policy. There's a lot of people that work in government who get this stuff, and who are very knowledgeable, and that isn't necessarily the problem. It's not that they're relying on the literacy in the public sphere to help them make decisions.
Yeah, I would have to agree on that. Yeah, definitely. I think that the erosion of science literacy has, I don't think it's made it into those you know, staff and decision maker rooms. I think the decision to ignore science and policy to making is not related to literacy, but rather ideology.
But it seems like, to me, it seems like an important point that if scientific literacy is low, and if, as Suzanne says, there's kind of a cultural anti-intellectualism that says, well, I don't really identify with the kind of people who study science, then that can lead, it seems to me, that ought to contribute to the problem of the public not understanding scientific perspectives, or resisting or rejecting scientific perspectives at times. And when I think of popular cultural representations of scientists, you know, most of them don't seem like regular people, you know, the scientists. They seem like some other kind of person that Americans, anyway, are not likely to relate to. And I wouldn't want the evening to pass without mentioning Leonard Nimoy, who we just lost, who is one of the most high-profile scientist characters in American culture, right? Spock was the science officer, and he's an alien.
I'd also make the point, too, that one of the interesting things is that, you know, some folks who may come off as anti-science, though when they get a scientist on their side, that's like a huge get, and they really hold that person up. The only person who mentions scientists on the Senate floor more than Sheldon Whitehouse is James Inhofe. He talks about him all the time. He's got, you know, like you said, about a half dozen, and he calls them out by name and holds them up high. So I think that's an interesting thing. Like, while there is some, you know, cultural disparity of scientists, let's say, actually both sides really like to claim them, don't they?
Yeah, they do, and it's a funny thing.
We have time for one more question, I think. Yes, I know you've been waiting. Oh, I'm sorry, but you have the microphone. Why don't we do two more questions?
Yeah.
Okay. This is partly question, partly comment. It shouldn't be surprising to us that our culture doesn't always treat science with great regard. I mean, I'm thinking back to growing up on the front bench of a Southern Baptist church and being told where I was going to go if I continued to talk about that evolutionary stuff. And this is just something that's embedded in the American psyche in some ways. And in some places, and the South is a good example of that, the culture is such that you are not allowed to question the received ideology, in this case, inerrancy, or a literal translation of the Bible. So, by the way, one correction, it's not 4,000, it's 6,000 years old.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah. And that, you know, but you do find museums, if that's the right word for it, where we have people stand, Adam and Eve in the presence of dinosaurs. It's an interesting thought, but I've often wondered how you can counter such a thing when it's so pervasive, and I'm not sure you can.
Maybe it's its own best medicine, though. I mean, you know, the crucible forms some of the great scientists. Here we have you know. You don't know what kind of culture raises the best scientists, but hopefully we're producing them.
Yeah, and I would just say this comes back a little bit to being careful about asking people to raise their right hand and tell you they believe in science. You know, there's a lot of discussions you can have about evidence that will sink into people without making them raise their right hand and say, I accept everything you just told me 100%. I now agree there's no debate. And you can make a lot of progress without requiring that pledge. And I've seen some interesting discussions sort of on the evolution point, because it's really hard to break away from your culture if you grew up in a culture that tells you, you know, the literal interpretation of the Bible is the only thing. At the same time, you probably also, when presented with evidence that viruses evolve, and you know, we've got to counteract that in medicine, or bacterial evolves, then you can, and you can accept those, and you can hold those two things and actually act upon them.
To get away from the idea of a person having to align with Al Gore and accept his policies, if you're not comfortable with that, or somebody on the other side, or some other politician or well-known figure, could there be people in government who are more in our government, where we have an agency like the National Science Foundation with professional civil servants who are committed to work in a scientific capacity for the government, who could be spokespeople, or could be, like, I don't even know who the director of the National Science Foundation is, who could speak to the public or on different issues and at different times, like, well, look how often an Assistant Secretary of Defense or Secretary of State is interviewed on the nightly news. But do we ever hear somebody from the National Science Foundation or some other professional government group, scientific, or even state of Rhode Island, maybe the governor has a science advisor who might say on the news or at a meeting or in some place, well, we've had this happen and this happen, and we know this, and we're thinking these days that this, as an way of informing the public.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and
I'd like your comment on that. And then, secondly, when you were talking about how people, well, earlier, I was thinking, how do we get people, you got excited when you said, we have the technology. Maybe we need to figure out how to get people engaged in the solution. You know, we need a solution. How can, you know, look at it that way? How do we engage people or get them committed to the solution of high tide, water rising? So they're willing to commit, spend a little money, think about it, change a habit or something.
Yeah, well, I'll just start with your last question first, which is, yeah, absolutely engaging people in problem solving, in solutions, in possibility, in you know, a variety of choices that actually help them envision a positive future, not a dreadful future. You know, talking about the doom and gloom doesn't motivate people to action. Talking about the solutions really does engage people. In terms of people in government, you know, there are military leaders who are talking about climate change. There, you know, NASA talks about climate change. NOAA, most of our science-based agencies are talking about climate change. They don't have the same platform. I mean, I think of, I don't know if any of you are familiar with James Hansen. He was the chief climate scientist at the Goddard Institute at NASA. He's the person who originally testified before Congress in 1988. He has been, I mean, just a top flight scientist. He started out on this trajectory, very staid. He retired a couple of years ago and is just like, I am dedicating my retirement to, like, you know, really rattling the cage. He's demonstrating, he's really out there in a positive way. And so people at all levels of government are doing it, and they don't have the same platform as you know, the Rush Limbaughs of the world, or you know, even the James Inhofes. So I agree that we need more voices, but they're there.
I'll just make a brief comment that I hold out hope that the conservative economists will rise up as the spokespeople. I mean, whether or not you're familiar with it, quite a few of them think that a reasonable solution to climate change is the best thing to do. And they're out there talking, they're just not being listened to. And I'll also just mention that I know 2008 seems like a long time ago, but there was a Republican presidential candidate and Republican platform that were committed to addressing climate change. So I think that we'll see that again, and that's what those are going to be the best spokespeople.
Well, we've run past our time. I want to thank everybody for their interest, and that's why we've gone over time. Thank you very much for the great questions and for participating. Thank you to our guests for great presentations. We hope to see you again soon at the Pell Center. Thanks for being here tonight.